Welcome to the Middle School Cafe podcast, where we're serving up fresh strategies and solutions for ELA teachers just like you. Join us as we explore proven methods to bridge the achievement gap and help every student reach their full potential. Whether you're a veteran teacher or just starting out, grab a cup of coffee and a notepad and let's get started. Here's your host, Carolyn Wall.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Middle School Cafe podcast. I can tell by the number of downloads we've had recently that we have a lot of new listeners, so I want to take a quick moment to say thank you for being here. I also thought today would be a good time to introduce or reintroduce myself. I'm Carolyn Wall. I'm a former middle school ELA teacher, and I currently work for a local university supporting pre-service teachers. It's been a great transition, and I really love that it gives me the opportunity to visit so many different classrooms. I specialize in helping teachers build strong reading routines and helping students grow more confident as readers. I really love connecting with other teachers, and I truly believe that some of the best professional learning comes from talking with people who are doing the work every day. That's why I recently opened a free ELA community for teachers focused on building strong, confident readers. It's a space for sharing ideas, asking questions, and talking through what's working, especially when it comes to reading instruction. The goal is for it to feel supportive and useful, not overwhelming. Inside the community, you'll find live trainings, free resources, and book recommendations you can share with your students. One of the best parts is that it lives off social media, so you don't have to compete with an algorithm just to see posts. It's simple to sign up, and if you'd like to be part of that conversation, you can find the link to join in the show notes. All right, let's jump into today's episode. In the last episode, we talked about easy ways to include nonfiction into independent reading, with the goal of making it feel less daunting for students. That conversation focused on helping students get more comfortable reading nonfiction without turning it into a big shift or a heavy lift. Today's episode builds on that idea. This episode kicks off a short mini-series on teaching research. We're starting by talking about why research often feels overwhelming for students and how we can approach research instruction in a way that feels more manageable for both you and your students. One reason research feels harder is that it asks students to use a very different set of skills than what they've been practicing with literature. When students read literature, they're usually working with one text at a time. They read for plot, character, or theme. The structure is familiar. There's a clear beginning, middle, and end. But research doesn't work that way. Research requires students to do a lot of things at the same time. They have to read texts more closely. They have to determine what information is relevant. They have to decide what matters and what doesn't. They often have to take notes. They're required to hold multiple ideas in their heads at once and connect information across sources, all while trying to stay focused. And here's where I want to pause for a minute, because this is the part that often gets missed. If research feels overwhelming in your classroom, it doesn't mean you don't know how to teach it. And it doesn't mean your students aren't capable. More often than not, it means too many skills are being asked for at the same time. That's an important distinction. Because when we look closely at what research actually involves, none of the skills themselves are new. We already teach students how to read closely. We teach them how to determine what's important. We teach them how to summarize, paraphrase, and use evidence. We teach them how to organize ideas and explain their thinking in writing. Research is where all of those skills collide, and that's where it starts to feel unmanageable, not because the skills are unfamiliar, but because they're happening simultaneously. So instead of thinking about research as this separate, intimidating thing we have to teach, it can be more helpful to think about research as a decision-making process. The real work is deciding which part of the thinking you want students to focus on at any given time. That shift alone can be empowering. When research feels heavy, it's often because the instructional focus isn't clear. Students are trying to read, take notes, evaluate information, and produce something all at once. Teachers are trying to support everything at the same time, and no one is quite sure what the priority is. But when you approach research through the lens of skill focus, it changes the entire experience for you and for your students. You're no longer asking, how do I teach research? You're asking, what thinking am I teaching today? That shift matters because it puts you back in control of the instruction Research stops being this big, undefined task and starts to look like the reading and writing instruction you already do every day. It becomes about choosing a specific kind of thinking and designing the lesson around that purpose. Some days, that thinking might be determining importance. You're helping students learn how to sift through information, notice what shows up repeatedly, and decide what actually matters for their topic, without writing down every single detail. Other days, the focus might be tracking ideas across sources. Students aren't expected to understand the whole topic yet. They're simply noticing how information connects, overlaps, or adds to what they already know. And sometimes, the work is practicing how to paraphrase without copying. The goal isn't perfect notes or polished writing, it's learning how to put information into their own words and recognize when they're relying too heavily on the original text. When you plan research this way, you're making an intentional choice about what students are practicing, and just as importantly, what they're not. And this is where I want to be really clear, because this is something teachers don't hear often enough. You don't need to assess every research skill every day. You don't need to check for determining importance, paraphrasing, source evaluation, organization, and synthesis all at once. Trying to do that usually makes it harder to see what students actually understand. Choosing one instructional focus doesn't lower rigor, it increases it. When the focus is clear, you can look more closely at student thinking. You can give more meaningful feedback. You can tell the difference between a student who's struggling with the content and a student who's struggling with the process. And just as importantly, students know what success looks like. They're not guessing which part of the work matters most that day. This also gives you permission to say, "We're not worrying about that yet." Not yet doesn't mean never. It means you're sequencing skills on purpose. You can also support this shift by being explicit with students about what the work is and what it isn't. Sometimes a simple reframe at the start of a research block can lower anxiety and focus attention. It might sound like, "Today, we're not trying to understand everything about this topic, we're practicing how to decide what information matters." Or, "Right now, the goal isn't a finished product. The goal is to practice this one part of the thinking." That kind of language helps students understand that research is about practice, not performance. You're not asking them to evaluate sources, write a paragraph, and synthesize information all at once. You're saying, "This is the thinking we're working on today." You are identifying the skill for students so they know what they need to focus on. That kind of clarity reduces cognitive overload and makes the learning visible. Students know what to focus on, you know what to look for, and feedback becomes much more specific because it's tied to a clear purpose. This also changes how we interpret student struggle. When a student is stuck, instead of seeing it as they don't get research, you can identify which part of the thinking needs more support. Is it deciding what's relevant? Is it holding on to ideas long enough to connect them? Is it putting information into their own words? Those are teachable moments, not signs that research isn't working. And over time, as students practice these individual skills, research starts to feel less intimidating. Not because it's easier, but because it's more familiar. Students begin to recognize the thinking they're being asked to do, even when the topic changes. That's the long-term goal, not to make research quick or effortless, but to make it understandable and manageable, one thinking skill at a time. And that's really the heart of this shift. Research becomes more teachable when we stop treating it as a single unit and start treating it as a process that develops over time. When research is framed this way, it also changes how you plan. You still start with the end in mind, what you want students to understand and be able to do. But as you work backward, the focus shifts to the thinking students need to practice along the way. Instead of jumping straight to the final product, you ask yourself a more immediate question. What thinking do my students need to work on right now to get to the next step? That question helps guide your day-to-day decisions, what texts you choose, how many sources you include, and what kind of support students need at each stage of the process. It also gives you permission to slow the process down, not to lower expectations, but to give students the time they need to actually practice the thinking that research requires. Depth comes from clarity, not from rushing. This is especially important to remember in middle school, where students are still developing academic stamina. When we give students repeated opportunities to practice individual research skills, they begin to see research as something they can do, not something they have to get through. And that's where confidence starts to build. This episode is really about reframing how we think about research instruction, not as a checklist or a project, but as a series of intentional teaching decisions. Over the next few episodes in this mini-series, we'll build on this idea by looking more closely at specific research skills. We'll talk about teaching students how to evaluate evidence in both reading and research, and we'll also explore how to help students spot bias in informational texts in developmentally appropriate ways. The goal is to keep these conversations realistic and sustainable for a middle school classroom. Thanks for spending part of your day here with me. Until next time. Thanks for joining me today. As a reminder, a new episode drops every first and third Tuesday, so be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. Be sure to visit middleschoolcafe.com to find links to everything mentioned in today's show. Until next time.